What if the headline everyone believed was built on the wrong moment, the wrong room, and the wrong timeline? A single unsealed email is now forcing Hollywood to re-examine who was actually present and who may have been pulled into a story they never signed up for. And tonight, we're breaking down how one quiet document could change everything you think you know about this case. The story begins long before the headlines ever knew it existed, long before any document was unsealed, long before any public statement hinted at tension behind the scenes. Because what the audience sees first is never the beginning. It is only the moment when silence finally breaks and suddenly everything that once felt distant becomes loud and unavoidable. And that is exactly how this situation unfolded, with whispers turning into reports, and reports turning into assumptions, and assumptions forming into certainty before the full truth had time to surface. And in this storm of interpretation, one newly revealed email now sits at the center of attention, not because it proves a final answer, but because it challenges the order in which people think events happened. And in stories like this, order is everything. Because the sequence determines motive, and motive determines judgment. And once judgment sets in, it becomes almost impossible to reverse. And that is the real danger when narratives move faster than verification. Because the crowd does not wait for confirmation, it waits for momentum. And once momentum forms, it carries every name involved along with it, whether they belong to that moment or not. And that is where the tension truly begins. Because some people may be reacting to an event they were never actually present for, while others may be reacting to an interpretation that was built on early drafts, not final facts. And what most viewers never see is the difference between internal preparation and public declaration. Because internal timelines are not court testimony, they're working documents built under pressure for strategy, not performance. And that distinction changes everything once you understand it. Because drafts exist to evolve, not to accuse. But when those drafts are later exposed without context, they can be framed as contradictions even when they are simply steps in an evolving understanding. And that is why this email matters, not for what it definitively proves, but for how it is being interpreted in real time. Because interpretation is now driving the public emotional response more than confirmed evidence, and that alone should slow everyone down. But in the digital age, slowing down is no longer the instinct. The instinct is to amplify, react, align, choose sides, and defend positions that may not survive the next reveal. And that is why this story feels unstable, because it is unfolding in layers rather than in a single clean arc. Behind-the-scenes productions are complex ecosystems built on countless moving parts, creative pressure, personality dynamics, scheduling stress, and the constant awareness that millions of people will eventually judge what comes out on screen. And that pressure alone reshapes how people interact long before any conflict ever appears publicly. And when high-profile names are added to that equation, the distortion increases. Because fame changes the gravity inside any room, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. And when creative authority feels challenged inside that gravity, misunderstandings grow faster than they would in a normal workplace. And that does not require bad intent. It requires only vulnerability, pride, and the fear of losing control over something that defines professional identity. And that is why so many entertainment disputes look confusing from the outside. Because from the outside, viewers see only the flashpoint, not the pressure that built beneath it. And this case is no different. Because what the public is responding to right now is not the slow accumulation of strain, but a single emotional moment that has been magnified into a defining narrative. And that transformation from moment to symbol is what distorts reality, because symbols carry moral weight, while moments simply carry context. And that weight is now being assigned across names, reputations, past work and future careers, all based on how viewers emotionally process a sequence they never actually witnessed and never will witness in full. What makes this story uniquely volatile is not just the presence of well-known figures, it is the way fans emotionally project onto those figures, because audiences do not view celebrities as neutral professionals. They view them as narrative characters in an ongoing story they feel personally invested in, and that investment reshapes how information is received, because evidence that supports a favorite narrative is embraced instantly, while evidence that complicates that narrative is resisted or reframed. And that is not rational behavior. It is human behavior, layered onto social media amplification, and the result is a feedback loop where the loudest interpretation becomes the most dominant, regardless of whether it is the most accurate. And once that happens, nuance becomes invisible because it does not travel as fast as outrage does, and it does not generate the same emotional surge. And this is where the concern truly lies, because nuance is what prevents people from being unfairly locked into permanent roles they never agreed to play. And yet nuance is the first casualty of viral discourse. The unsealed email that has now captured attention is being treated by many as a smoking mirror, something that confirms what they already believed rather than something that deserves careful analysis. And that is a dangerous approach, because documents do not speak emotionally, they speak structurally. And when they are read through emotional lenses, their original purpose is often lost. And in this case, the purpose appears to have been preparation, not accusation, organization, not narrative control. And when preparation documents are later reframed as definitive statements, confusion is almost guaranteed, because preparation deals in possibilities, not conclusions. And that is likely why this single email feels both revealing and misleading at the same time, because it contains fragments of memory, not finalized determinations. And yet those fragments are now being circulated as if they represent settled truth. And that is where perception begins to outrun reality once again. The suspense in this story is not just about what happened inside a private space on a specific date. It is about how many versions of that date now exist, depending on who was telling it and why. And in conflicts like this, motivations matter, not only at the moment of the event, but at the moment of retelling. And once legal stakes are introduced, motivations shift yet again, because words are no longer just expressions, they become instruments. And that transition reshapes memory, because survival mode replaces reflection, and protection replaces collaboration. And once that shift occurs, every prior interaction is re-evaluated under defensive logic. And that is when timelines become contested maps rather than shared records. And that appears to be exactly where the situation now sits, at the intersection between memory, documentation, and strategy. For viewers watching from the outside, it can feel as though each new reveal delivers clarity, but often it only adds another layer of fog, because true clarity requires full context, and full context rarely arrives all at once, especially while legal processes are active. And that delay creates space for speculation to flourish. And speculation is rarely kind, because it fills gaps with imagination rather than restraint. And imagination, under public pressure, tends to lean toward the dramatic rather than the measured. And that is why this story continues to feel like it is constantly on the edge of a larger turn, even when the verified facts remain limited, because the audience is not reacting to what is fully known. They are reacting to what feels implied. An implication is powerful because it allows people to complete the story inside their own minds. And once they complete it, they emotionally invest in their version of events. And that emotional investment is what keeps people watching, commenting, sharing, and returning for the next update. And that is the loop that sustains modern controversy. At this stage, what matters most is not whose version feels more compelling, but whose version ultimately aligns with verifiable sequence, because sequence is the only anchor that prevents narrative drift. And narrative drift is exactly what transforms professional disputes into cultural flashpoints. And as long as the sequence remains in question, the story will remain unresolved in the public mind, because uncertainty itself fuels continued attention. And continued attention ensures that every new document, no matter how technical it may be, will be interpreted as potentially explosive. And that is where we are right now, poised between fragments of preparation and the hunger for final meaning. And that tension is what continues to drive the story forward. As the story moves forward, the tension no longer lives only in what might have happened, but in how every side now chooses to frame what may have happened. Because framing is where influence quietly operates. And once perception hardens, it becomes the battlefield where reputations are either fortified or stripped away. And what makes this phase of the narrative especially unstable is that both the public and the private sides are reacting at the same time. The audience is forming conclusions while legal teams are forming strategies. And those two processes rarely move at the same speed, which creates a distortion field where partial information appears definitive simply because no full version has yet arrived. And inside that distortion, every phrase, every sentence, every resurfaced note begins to feel charged with meaning far beyond its original purpose. And that is why this moment feels like it could tilt at any second, even though nothing legally final has yet landed. Because emotionally, the scale is already shifting daily across social platforms, commentary sections, and media cycles. And once those scales start moving independently of verified outcomes, it becomes nearly impossible to stabilize the narrative without something unmistakably conclusive and unmistakably transparent. What the audience rarely sees during controversies like this is the psychological whiplash experienced by those involved. Because when public interpretation accelerates, people inside the situation lose the ability to simply process what occurred. They must process how what occurred is being publicly understood, which is a completely different psychological task because it forces them to defend not only their actions, but also interpretations they may never have considered when those actions originally took place. And that alters memory inside the mind, because memory under defense rewrites itself subtly, not out of deception, but out of survival, because the mind seeks coherence under threat. And coherence often requires simplification, and simplification is where nuance disappears. And that is why complex interpersonal dynamics collapse into good and bad, hero and villain, winner and loser, even when reality does not fit cleanly into those shapes. And once that collapse happens, it becomes very hard for the public to accept later that the truth sat somewhere between those extremes, rather than cleanly inside one side of them. The presence of powerful figures around disputed moments also magnifies distortion, because power changes how people later interpret their own reactions. Someone may remember feeling intimidated, not because intimidation was intended, but because the room carried a weight that altered how the moment was internally experienced. And that difference between intent and impact is one of the most misunderstood mechanics in public disputes, because audiences often demand to know what someone meant, while the affected party speaks from how it felt. And both can be sincerely true at the same time, without one canceling out the other. And yet, public narratives often refuse to hold those dual truths simultaneously, because contradiction feels uncomfortable, and people crave moral certainty even when real life does not provide it. And that craving pushes stories toward absolutes rather than complexities. As additional fragments circulate, they are rarely consumed slowly. Viewers are absorbing them in algorithm-driven bursts, framed by commentary, analysis, and reaction, rather than by original context. And that layering alters meaning before the viewer ever directly encounters the material. And once interpretation arrives pre-packaged, it becomes the dominant lens through which all subsequent information is filtered. And that is why early framing matters so profoundly, because it establishes the emotional architecture that later details must fit inside. And if a new detail does not fit easily, it is either rejected or forced into compliance with the dominant frame. And this mechanism explains why two people can read the same document and walk away with opposite conclusions, each believing the document confirmed what they already felt. And that is not because one reader is necessarily dishonest, but because perception organizes evidence to protect pre-existing alignment. The conversation around this story is now less about reconstructing moments and more about defending identity, because each side has become symbolically attached to broader cultural narratives about power, creativity, loyalty, and accountability. And once cases become symbolic rather than individual, the pressure multiplies because people no longer argue about one dispute. They argue about what that dispute represents at large. And that expansion of meaning makes resolution harder, not easier. Because even if legal outcomes provide clarity, symbolic outcomes remain contested. And symbolic outcomes are what linger in public memory long after verdicts fade from headlines. And that is why many high-profile disputes never truly end. They simply shift from courtrooms to cultural shorthand, where names become references and lessons rather than people, and situations become archetypes rather than histories. Inside this expanding symbolic field, every decision now carries amplified risk, because how each side speaks or remains silent will be read not only as legal positioning, but as moral signaling. And in that environment, even restraint can be misread as avoidance, and even direct statements can be misread as manipulation. And that creates a trap where nothing feels safe to say, and yet silence feels equally dangerous. And that is the tension that now surrounds every potential update in this unfolding story. Because the audience has learned to expect escalation, and escalation becomes the invisible contract between controversy and attention. And breaking that contract requires a clarity so strong that it overwhelms speculation itself, which is a rare outcome in real-time narratives. What continues to hold the attention of viewers is not the technical complexity of the documents, but the unresolved emotional contradiction at the core of the tale. Because people are still trying to reconcile how the same sequence of days can be remembered in such different emotional tones. And that contradiction invites curiosity, because the human mind instinctively seeks harmony between narrative and feeling. And when harmony fails, curiosity intensifies rather than fade. And that is why each new reveal, even when procedural, feels electric, because it promises to resolve that inner dissonance, even if it ultimately does not. And the cycle repeats. The uncertainty surrounding who knew what and when they knew it continues to act as the central engine of suspense, because awareness implies responsibility in the public imagination. And while legal systems carefully define responsibility through evidence thresholds, public systems define responsibility through perceived proximity and emotional association. And those two frameworks operate independently, which is why someone can be legally peripheral, yet symbolically central. And once that symbolic center is occupied, it becomes difficult to dislodge, because the image solidifies through repetition, not proof. And repetition is what algorithms reward most consistently. As more dates are debated and more sequences compared, the narrative has begun circulating less as a linear timeline and more as an overlapping collage of partial memories, statements, reactions, and interpretations. And collages do not prioritize causality, they prioritize impact. And that shift from causality to impact is what makes this story feel as though it is constantly moving, even when no new definitive fact has emerged. Because impact does not require closure. It only requires continued emotional stimulation. And that stimulation now arrives through speculation rather than conclusion. Viewers are now positioned in a suspended state, waiting for the piece that finally makes the puzzle click. But the quiet truth of long-form disputes is that puzzles rarely resolve through a single piece. They resolve slowly, through accumulation and patience. And patience is the one resource the modern media environment actively discourages. And that mismatch between slow truth and fast consumption ensures that discomfort remains embedded in the experience for both the audience and those inside the story. And that discomfort is what keeps the narrative alive, because comfort would signal closure, and closure would end the loop. And the loop is what continues to generate attention, debate, alignment, and emotional investment. At this point, the story is no longer simply about an interaction or a document. It is about how perception itself is formed, challenged, defended, and revised under pressure. And that transformation is happening in real time, with millions of witnesses participating through interpretation rather than direct observation. And the power of that collective participation is what gives this case its ongoing gravitational pull. Because viewers are no longer passive receivers of information, they are active validators of narrative meaning through engagement and reaction. And once audiences become participants, the story gains momentum, independent of its original scale. And that is exactly the stage this situation has now entered. And as this phase continues, the most important tension is no longer what happened, but what the public will ultimately accept as having happened. Because acceptance is what writes the enduring version of events. And acceptance is shaped by repetition, visibility, emotional resonance, and perceived credibility, not by procedural nuance. And that distinction is what makes the current moment so volatile, because the enduring version is still being negotiated, not in court, but in the collective imagination. And once that version settles, it may outlast any legal outcome that follows. And that possibility is what keeps every new update feeling consequential, even when it arrives only as a fragment rather than a final answer. And as this story continues to unfold, remember, the loudest moment is rarely the truest one. Documents change, timelines shift, and perception evolves. But what never changes is the power of patience, because the full truth never arrives all at once. Stay aware, stay critical, and don't let headlines finish the story before the facts do.